April 10th, 1912. Sailing day had finally arrived. Soon after sunrise, at approximately 5:23 a.m., the men and women of Titanic's crew said their goodbyes to their family and friends, and began making their way toward the docks where the great ship awaited. Having spent the past few nights at the Southwestern Hotel, Titanic's designer, Thomas Andrews, was up bright and early, wasting no time in heading down to berth 44, where at 6 a.m. he was among the first aboard. Immediately, he set about making a final inspection of his ship. An hour later, at his home at 34 Wynn Road, Highfield, Captain Edward J. Smith donned a bowler hat and overcoat and stepped out into the chilly morning air. He picked up the day's paper from the local paperboy before taking a taxi down to his ship. As he got in, he waved goodbye to his wife, Sarah, and their 12-year-old daughter, Helen, who stood in the doorway. Captain Smith, now 62, was nearing the age for retirement soon, and was looking forward to spending more time with his young daughter. Yet he was still excited about commanding Titanic on her maiden voyage, possibly the crowning achievement of his lengthy career. Arriving at the dock at 7:30 a.m., Smith went straight to his quarters on the boat deck to change into his uniform and received the sailing report from Chief Officer Henry Wilde. Behind Captain Smith on the gangway was Captain Maurice Clark, who had just inspected the ship the day before. His duties on sailing day included overseeing the crew muster, which began at 8 a.m. sharp, with the assistance of the ship's officers and heads of various crew departments. He then set off to supervise the boat drill. Titanic's crew was so large, coming in at 892 members, that each department was mustered on separate decks to keep things simple. It took about an hour to complete the muster. By contrast, the boat drill was much simpler. The necessary officers and seamen gathered on the aft starboard boat deck and quickly prepared the boats. Only 2 lifeboats would be used in this drill, numbers 11 and 13. They were uncovered, swung out, lowered to the deck level, their rudders fitted, and oars prepared before being manned. Each boat had a quartermaster and 7 seamen to row, along with a junior officer in command. The order was given to lower these boats, and the 2 made the 70-foot descent into the water. Once afloat, they rowed around the dock, past the older laid-up liners, and were supposed to return by hoisting their masts and sailing back. However, the morning was windy, so the crew rowed back. Afterwards, the remainder of the morning was relatively relaxed. The officers were able to take time to eat breakfast. The 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. watch was sent below, the noon to 4 p.m. watch was put on standby, and the rest were informally dismissed until half an hour before sailing time, free to go ashore and enjoy the next couple of hours as they wished. At around this time, the first of 2 boat trains from London arrived at the dock, this one carrying second and third class passengers. The first class train had only just set off from Waterloo Station, and would not arrive for another 2 hours. In the meantime, these first group of passengers began boarding the majestic liner. Second class passengers boarded high up on C deck, while third class entered on E deck and were examined by a medical officer as they boarded. A reporter touring the ship noted that many of the third class passengers were fair-haired and happy-looking Scandinavians. A few first class passengers who had arrived early and spent the night in Southampton were already aboard, getting to know their new surroundings. Most notable among them was J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line. He boarded along with his wife and their 3 youngest children, though they would not be accompanying him on the voyage. They had come only to see him off and get a quick tour of the ship. The London photographers who had visited the ship the day before were also roaming about, snapping more photographs of her luxurious accommodations, including the Veranda Cafe and Palm Court, the Café Parisien, and the spacious A-deck promenade stretching for hundreds of feet. A few of the unbooked first-class suites were opened for them, as well as Bruce Ismay's own private promenade. They also spent some time in the gymnasium, which was well patronized, particularly by second-class passengers who were enjoying the luxury of first class before the bulk of those passengers had boarded. Before disembarking, the pressman managed to get a photograph or 2 of Captain Smith, standing proudly at the bridge of his new command. The photographers would remain at Titanic's side after going ashore, waiting to photograph the departure itself. Finally, at 11:30 a.m., the first-class boat train arrived, bringing the last of Titanic's passengers due to board at Southampton. There were still hundreds more who would board in Cherbourg that evening, as well as the following day in Queenstown. The crew, dismissed following the boat drill, began making their way back after finishing up their last rounds of drinks at local pubs. Not all of them will make it back in time, however, and a few would be left behind. Posts aboard Titanic were highly sought by those in Southampton affected by the strike, and standby crewmen readily signed on in place of those who dawdled. At 11:45 a.m., the ship's bells rang out, signaling all ashore to the ship's visitors, who quickly made their way down her gangways, which were then pulled away. Departure time was fast approaching. A small fleet of tugs made their way to Titanic, black smoke belching from their small funnels, the wind carrying it over Titanic's towering decks. Many of Titanic's passengers lined her decks, waving goodbye to the hundreds watching from the dock. While there was no band dockside as there had been for Olympic the previous summer, Titanic's own band struck up a cheerful tune as the orders came down from the bridge to cast off. It was just past noon, and Titanic's maiden voyage had finally begun. She moved slowly at first, with the local tug Neptune leading the way and pulling the mighty ship out from the White Star dock. Photographers, both ashore and aboard, hurriedly snapped pictures as she got underway. The aft tug swung her stern clear as she left the dock, aided by Titanic's own propellers. She then proceeded down the River Test, passing the laid-up liners Oceanic and New York. What happened next is best described by someone who witnessed the whole ordeal. As the bows of our ship came about level with those of the New York, there came a series of reports, like those of a revolver. On the quay side of the New York, snaky coils of thick rope flung themselves high in the air and fell backward among the crowd. And then, to our amazement, the New York crept toward us, slowly and stealthily, as if drawn by some invisible force, which she was powerless to withstand. On the New York, there was shouting of orders, sailors running to and fro. The tug, which had a few moments before cast off from Titanic's bows, came up around our own stern and passed to the quay side of New York's stern. It made fast to her and began hauling her back with all the force her engines were capable of. At first, it seemed the sterns of the two vessels would collide, but from Titanic's stern bridge, an officer directing operations stopped us dead, and the New York, with her tug trailing behind, moved obliquely down the dock, her stern gliding along Titanic's side a few yards away. Another tug came up and took hold of the New York by the bows, and between the two of them, they dragged her around the corner of the quay, which ended just here on the side of the river. Lawrence Beasley, second-class passenger. After this near disaster just minutes into the voyage, Titanic paused briefly. The tug Vulcan, which had prevented the near collision, came alongside her port stern to take off some standby crew who had not disembarked before she left berth. Titanic's engines then started up again, and once more she proceeded down Southampton water, making 11 to 12 knots. By this time, her upper decks were practically deserted, as nearly everyone had gone to their respective dining saloons to enjoy lunch, which in first class included roast beef, grilled mutton chops, fresh lobsters, mashed, fried, baked potatoes, rice pudding, and more. As she sailed past Cowes on the Isle of Wight, famed photographer Frank Beacon was ready with his camera, carefully balancing in his boat on the surface of the water. Captain Smith spotted him off Titanic's starboard bow, and blew her whistles as she passed the small craft. Beacon snapped 2 of the finest photos ever taken of the ship. A few passengers were back up on deck at this time, enjoying the scenic views of the Solent. Others were still below, unpacking and settling into their staterooms. Titanic then slowed as she reached the Nab light to let off her pilot before turning her bow southward to the French port of Cherbourg. She made the 66-mile trip across the channel at just over 20 knots, arriving in Cherbourg at about 6:30 p.m., a bit behind schedule. When she dropped anchor in the harbor, the sun had only begun to dip below the western horizon. White Star's two tenders, Nomadic and Traffic, were already waiting, with hundreds of passengers, pieces of luggage, and mail aboard. Built alongside Titanic in Belfast the previous year, they were mini Titanics in their own right, utilizing many of the same design elements. Nomadic with first and second class passengers, while Traffic carrying third class passengers and mail. Among those boarding in Cherbourg were the Astors, the Duff Gordons, Mrs. Margaret Brown, and Edith Rosenbaum, along with her copious amounts of luggage. She was a fashion reporter bringing the latest Parisian gowns to New York, some of her trunks eventually even getting their own stateroom on A-deck. At 8:10 p.m., Titanic weighed anchor and headed northwest on her way to Queenstown, where she was due just before noon the next day. Dinner was being served as she got underway, and despite running westward at over 20 knots, she was so steady and free of vibration that some passengers didn't even know they had already left France. Being a windy night, hardly anyone was out on deck besides crew. Passengers in first class enjoyed the warmth of the reception room, drinking after-dinner coffee, and listening as the band played The Tales of the Hoffman and Cavalleria Rusticana, among other tunes.